The worst person I've ever known was my twin sister. Her evil wasn't something you could blame on circumstance or trauma. It was stitched into her from the very beginning, a dark thread running through everything she was. At 10 years old, she climbed onto a step stool, lifted a steaming kettle from the stove, and turned to look directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the kitchen. She smiled, a sweet, cherubic smile, the kind that made strangers stop and coo at how adorable she was, and then tipped the boiling water over her own face. The scream that followed brought the whole household running. She lay writhing on the tile floor, clutching her blistering cheek, and through the agony she pointed a trembling finger at me. "It was Emma," she sobbed, her voice a masterpiece of wounded innocence. "Emma said my face was prettier than hers. She said she was going to fix it." That night, my parents locked me in the basement. No light, no food, no water. I curled up on the cold concrete, my small body trembling with hunger and confusion, and listened to my own heartbeat, trying to understand what I had done wrong. 3 days later, when they finally pulled me out, I saw Ella sitting in our mother's lap, her face wrapped in gauze, eating strawberry cake with a silver fork. She caught my eye and blinked, slow and deliberate, like a cat toying with a half-dead mouse. That look, that tiny, knowing flicker, has haunted me for 15 years. At 18, on the night before the national college entrance exam that would have sent me to the top university in the country, she stood in my bedroom and tore my admission ticket into confetti. The pieces fluttered down around her feet like dirty snow, and she laughed while I screamed. "You're so smart, Emma," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You can take a gap year. Keep me company. I have depression, you know. I can't help the things I do. You understand, don't you?" She walked out with my study notes under her arm, and the next morning I knelt on the pavement outside the testing center, begging a security guard who wouldn't even look at me. My knees bled through my jeans. Strangers stepped around me like I was garbage. As an adult, she turned her gaze on Ethan, my fiancé. On my wedding day, I found her in the bridal suite, wearing the backup wedding dress that had been tailored to my measurements. She had set up her phone on a tripod, angled the ring light perfectly, and gone live to an audience of tens of thousands. The thin blade of a box cutter rested against her pale wrist. "If my sister won't let me have him," she whispered into the camera, tears streaming down her cheeks, "then I have nothing left to live for." I remember the crushing weight of my wedding gown as I dropped to my knees on that cold marble floor, the seams digging into my skin as I begged her to stop. I remember the click of the blade breaking skin, the bright bead of blood, the chaos as the door burst open. I remember the headlines the next day: "Jealous bride drives twin sister to suicide attempt." I lost my job. My friends vanished. Strangers spat on me in the street. I sank into a depression so deep that I forgot what sunlight felt like. And when I finally climbed to the roof of a 60-story building, the wind tearing at my clothes, I looked down and saw her. Ella. Standing beside Ethan in the crowd below, her face tilted up toward me, wearing the same smile she had worn at 10 years old. She mouthed a silent countdown. 3, 2, 1. I stepped into the empty air. The fall lasted 5 seconds. I felt the wind screaming past my ears, the impossible speed, and then nothing. Then I opened my eyes, and I was back. Standing in the bridal suite. The heavy ivory satin of my wedding dress still hung from my shoulders. The scent of roses and hairspray filled the room. And there she was, Ella, draped in my spare gown, pressing a box cutter to her wrist, her phone's live stream light blinking green. Her voice quavered into the camera. "I can't live like this anymore. I love Ethan so much, and he's marrying my sister. If this is my fate, I'd rather die. She glanced up at me through her lashes, and for a split second, beneath the trembling lip performance, I caught the glint of pure, predatory anticipation. She was waiting for me to fall to my knees. Waiting for me to tear off my veil and sob and hand over my entire life on a silver platter, just as I had done before. The muscle memory of that humiliation burned in my chest, the cold marble under my kneecaps, the rasp of her laughter barely concealed behind theatrical weeping. My throat tightened with the ghost of it, a phantom pain as sharp as any blade. The old Emma, the one who had died on that pavement 60 stories below, would have crumbled. She would have dropped to the floor and begged, and Ella knew it. But the old Emma was dead. I had felt my bones shatter. I had tasted my own blood. I had been reborn into this exact moment with a single, crystalline purpose, to burn her world to the ground. I didn't kneel. I walked, very calmly, into the small kitchenette attached to the suite. My heels clicked on the tile, a steady, unhurried rhythm that was the antithesis of panic. I could feel her gaze on my back, confused, and then I heard the softest hitch in her theatrical sobs. She hadn't scripted this. I pulled open a drawer. The caterers had left a chef's knife, a heavy, professional-grade blade, 8 inches of honed steel that caught the light like a mirror. I wrapped my fingers around the handle. It felt solid. Real. Grounding. A tool of absolute finality. I walked back into the room and held it out to her, hilt first, the tip glinting under the soft vanity lights. "Here, sweet sister." My voice came out low and smooth, almost gentle, the kind of voice you might use to soothe a frightened child. "Slitting your wrists takes forever, and it's so messy. You have to saw back and forth, and if you miss the artery, you just lie there in pain for hours. It's terribly inefficient." I nudged the blade closer, until the flat of it brushed against her trembling fingers. "This will be much faster. One clean cut across the throat, carotid artery, jugular vein, done in seconds. Consider it my wedding gift." I smiled, and it was the warmest smile I had ever given her. "I wish you and Ethan a lifetime of happiness, however short that may be." Ella's face went slack. The box cutter trembled in her fingers, the flimsy blade glinting uselessly under the soft lighting. For a single, breathtaking second, I saw a real fear flicker in her eyes, not the rehearsed terror of her performances, but the raw, animal panic of a predator who has suddenly realized the prey has teeth and is smiling back. Her carefully constructed mask cracked, just for an instant, and beneath it I glimpsed the bewildered fury of a manipulator who had lost control of the script. She had spent 2 decades perfecting her role, and I had just torn the pages to shreds with one kitchen knife. The live chat erupted. Messages scrolled so fast they blurred into streaks of white, the screen a frantic strobe of collective shock. I caught fragments as they flew past. Wait, did the sister just... She's handing her a knife. Is this a joke? Someone call the police. No, wait, look at the other sister's face, she's faking it. The narrative was cracking, just a hairline fracture, but I knew how fractures worked. Put enough pressure on them, and they split wide open. The door slammed open with a force that splintered the frame. Ethan stormed in, his custom-tailored tuxedo straining at the shoulders, his face contorted into a mask of righteous fury. He looked like a hero charging into battle, and I almost laughed because I knew exactly how this scene was supposed to play out. "Emma! You vicious!" He didn't finish the word. He lunged forward, swatting the chef's knife from my hand. It clattered to the floor and spun, the tip scoring a thin, screeching line across the marble tile. Then he shoved me backward. My hip caught the sharp corner of the vanity, and pain exploded through my side, sharp and nauseating. I gripped the edge of the counter and let the sting wash through me, cataloging it, filing it away. Pain was an old friend now. Pain was information. And this particular piece of information told me that Ethan Reed was exactly the man I remembered, a brute in a bespoke suit, a coward who only threw punches when he thought no one was watching. Ella collapsed into his arms as though her bones had dissolved. She buried her face against his chest, her body racking with sobs so perfectly pitched they could have been scored by a composer. Ethan, she tried to make me do it. She handed me a knife and told me to kill myself. She said it would be faster. I was so scared. Her tears soaked into the lapel of his jacket, leaving dark, spreading stains like ink blots. He cradled her as if she were made of spun glass, one hand pressing a handkerchief to the shallow scratch on her wrist, a scratch so superficial it barely beaded blood, the kind of wound that would heal without a scar by morning, and when he lifted his eyes to me, the tenderness evaporated in an instant. His gaze became ice, cold and absolute. "Emma, do you have any idea what you've done? She has depression. Clinical depression. You know she's unstable. You handed her a knife and goaded her to kill herself on a live stream. If she dies today, I will make sure you pay. I will personally destroy everything you have left." Depression. Clinical depression. The words echoed in my skull, and for a moment I was back on that rooftop, the wind screaming, the city sprawling beneath me like a circuit board of indifferent lights. I remembered the weightlessness of the fall, the snap of impact that I mercifully didn't live long enough to fully feel. And I remembered her face below me, smiling, counting down. 3, 2, 1. The memory coiled in my stomach like a snake, cold and venomous. Pay. I repeated the word slowly, tasting it. I let it hang in the air, heavy and strange. My life. I already gave you that once. Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion flickering behind the anger. What are you talking about? You're not making any sense. I didn't explain. Let him wonder. Let him chew on those words later, in the dark, when sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I let my expression crumple. I had learned how to cry on command, ironically, from watching her my entire life. A single tear traced a slow, perfect path down my cheek, catching the ring light like a diamond, and I let my voice crack just enough to sound wounded rather than angry. Ethan, you misunderstood. She said she couldn't live without you. She was crying about how desperate she was. I was trying to help her. I thought, if this is what she truly wants, if death is the only answer, then as her sister, shouldn't I help her end her suffering quickly? I pressed a hand to my chest, my fingers splaying over my heart. Isn't that what love is? To help someone you care about, even when it breaks you to do it. His mouth opened and closed. For the first time, I saw his certainty waver, a tiny crack in the fortress of his self-righteousness. His eyes darted from me to Ella, then to the phone still streaming on its tripod. He was calculating. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. The live chat was still scrolling, and I watched the comments shift in real time on the screen over his shoulder. Wait, so the sister was trying to help? That's twisted but also kind of. I mean, if someone really wants to die. Hang on, why is the other sister wearing the bride's wedding dress? Is nobody going to talk about that? No, seriously, she's in a wedding dress in the bride's suite. This is insane. The tide was turning, one comment at a time, and Ethan could feel it. His knight in shining armor narrative was developing cracks, and he didn't know how to patch them. Ella sensed the shift too. She always did. Her survival depended on reading the room with predatory precision. She clutched at Ethan's lapel, her breathing suddenly ragged and shallow, her body going limp with theatrical precision. "I can't, my chest. I can't breathe. Ethan, it hurts." Her head lolled against his shoulder, the picture of a fragile damsel in distress. It was a flawless performance, honed over 2 decades. Ethan's attention snapped back to her like a rubber band. He scooped her into his arms, her white skirt trailing behind her like a bridal train, and carried her toward the door. He paused beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same sandalwood scent I had once found comforting, now cloying and suffocating. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "What you did today makes me sick," he said, his voice low and meant only for my ears. "You're not the woman I proposed to. You're something else entirely." Then he was gone, carrying my twin sister through the hotel corridor in her stolen wedding gown, and I was alone with the live stream still running, the chat still scrolling, the chef's knife still gleaming on the floor. I bent down and picked it up. My reflection stared back at me from the blade, distorted and cold, a funhouse mirror version of myself. I raised my voice just enough for the phone to pick it up, letting my tone become light, almost cheerful. "Goodbye, you two. May your love story be as eternal as you deserve." The comments exploded. The fracture had become a canyon. My parents arrived 3 minutes later. I heard my mother before I saw her, the frantic click of her heels on marble, the shrill call of my sister's name echoing off the high ceilings. "Ella! Where's my baby? What happened?" When Laura Collins burst through the door with my father Frank storming behind her, her pearl necklace askew and her face blotchy with panic, she didn't look at me. She scanned the room, searching for Ella, her eyes skating over me as though I were a piece of furniture. "Where is she? We heard she collapsed. What did you do to her?" My father didn't bother with questions. He advanced on me, his face a thundercloud, and his finger jabbed toward my face, stopping an inch from my nose. You did this. You humiliated this family on the most important day of your life. Your sister has an illness, and you pushed her to the brink. Do you want to kill her? Do you want to kill us? Is that what you want? A dead sister and broken parents, is that the wedding gift you're after?" I had heard these words before. 100 variations, 1,000 times, across 2 lifetimes. When I was 10 and starving in the basement, they said I should have been more understanding of Ella's sensitivities. When I was 18 and sobbing outside the exam hall, they said her illness made her impulsive and I needed to be the bigger person. When I was an adult and she stole my fiancé, they said I was being selfish, that Ethan had clearly loved her all along and I had just been too stubborn to see it. And now, on the day that should have been mine, they were telling me my humiliation was my own fault. The sheer, breathtaking injustice of it pressed against my ribs like a physical weight, an anvil sitting on my chest. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I had spilled all my tears for these people in another lifetime. They had taken everything from me once. They would not take my composure now. I straightened my spine and looked at them with eyes that were perfectly, unnervingly calm. She took my fiancé. She wore my dress. She staged a suicide attempt in my bridal suite, on my wedding day. The groom is the one who walked out. The shame belongs to them, not to me. My father's hand flew up to strike me. I saw it coming, the same arc I had flinched from 1,000 times as a child, and this time, I didn't flinch. I caught his wrist mid-air and held it. His bones felt fragile under my grip, bird-like, and something flickered in his eyes. Shock, yes, but also the first glimmer of uncertainty. He had never seen me fight back. In his mind, I was still the docile, obedient daughter who absorbed punishment like dry earth absorbs rain. "You want to hit me?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. For her. The daughter who has lied to you every single day of her life. Go ahead. But know that if your hand lands, you will never see me again. Something in my tone made him hesitate. His arm went slack in my grip, and I released him. He stumbled back a step, his face a mixture of rage and bewilderment. My mother's voice sliced through the tension, high and defensive. Ella has depression. You've always been jealous of her. Ethan loved her first, anyone could see that. You only got engaged because you threw yourself at him. And now you've nearly killed her with your cruelty. You should be ashamed. Ethan loved her first. The lie was so brazen, so utterly detached from reality, that I almost laughed. Ethan had chased me for months, 50 text messages a night, a rain-soaked confession outside my dormitory where he knelt in a puddle and swore he couldn't live without me, a diamond ring presented in front of our entire company at the holiday party while 200 people applauded. My mother knew all of this. She had been at that party. She had clapped. And now she chose to erase it, to rewrite history the same way she had chosen to believe a 10-year-old would scald her own face rather than admit her precious youngest might be a monster. I smiled. The expression felt foreign on my face, a mask I was still learning to wear, but I held it. Fine. Since you all think I'm the obstacle to their great love, then let me be generous. I turned toward the door as if addressing an invisible audience, my voice carrying clearly. Ella's always wanted grandmother's waterfront penthouse, hasn't she? The one with the panoramic bay views. It's worth close to $10 million. I was going to keep it as my home, but I'd rather give it to the happy couple. As a wedding gift. A token of my blessing. Silence fell so suddenly I could hear the distant hum of the hotel's air conditioning. Then I heard it, a tiny, involuntary intake of breath from the corridor. Ella had been listening. Of course she had. Her greed was so powerful it practically had its own gravitational pull. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, still leaning weakly against Ethan but with a new brightness in her eyes that her acting couldn't quite conceal. The tears were still wet on her cheeks, but her pupils were dilated with want, black holes of pure avarice. The penthouse. Grandmother's penthouse. She had coveted it for years, dropping hints at every family dinner, spinning tales about how the waterfront air would help her condition, how a quiet space with views of the bay would be so therapeutic for her fragile nerves. What she really wanted was the address, the status, the 7-figure asset she could flaunt on her live streams. And I was handing it to her. Or so she thought. Emma, you really mean that? Her voice was small, tremulous, the voice of a wounded dove. But beneath it, I could hear the hunger. It was the same hunger I had heard in her voice when she was 10, standing over me in the basement, whispering through the door, "Are you hungry, Emma?" "I'm eating cake." "Of course," I said, spreading my hands like a beneficent queen. "The paperwork will take a few days, but you can move in immediately. Consider it an early wedding present. I just want you to be happy. Both of you." I turned my smile to Ethan, and I saw his expression war between greed and suspicion. Greed won. It always did with him. He cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim his earlier indignation but unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. "A penthouse doesn't erase what you did today." "Of course not," I agreed, my tone as smooth as cream. "But it's a start." My father grunted, already mollified by the mention of valuable property staying in the family. My mother sniffed and smoothed her skirt, her maternal outrage suddenly banked by the promise of a multi-million-dollar asset for her favorite child. "Make sure the transfer happens quickly. We don't want the Reeds to think we're stingy." I watched them leave, Ella nestled against Ethan, my parents flanking them like attendants, and I kept the serene smile fixed on my face until the elevator doors slid shut. Then I let it drop. The smile fell away like a discarded mask, and what remained was something cold and sharp and patient. I walked back into the bridal suite, closed the door, and stood very still in the silence. The penthouse. My grandmother had left it to me with trembling, papery hands, her voice a whisper as she lay in her hospital bed. "This is your safety, Emma. Your independence. Never let anyone take it from you. Not your parents, not your sister, not anyone." For a moment, guilt pricked at my conscience, sharp and insistent. I was about to sell the only thing she had ever given me. But I pushed the guilt away. Grandmother would understand. She, more than anyone, had seen through Ella's act. She had warned me, years ago, and I hadn't listened. She would want me to use every weapon at my disposal. I picked up my phone and dialed Tiffany, my real estate agent. "List the waterfront penthouse," I said, my voice crisp and businesslike. 25% below market. Cash buyers only. I want it sold and closed within the week. And Tiffany. The current occupants think they're staying. They're not. Make sure the buyers do a walkthrough as soon as the ink is dry. By the time I hung up, I was already scrolling to a contact I had never used in this life but had burned into my memory from the last. Kevin Carter. The most ruthless investigative journalist in the city, a man who had won national awards for toppling corrupt politicians and exposing corporate fraud. His articles were scalpels, precise, merciless, and unanswerable. In my previous life, he had written the piece that sealed my fate. Twisted sister, bride bullies twin into suicide attempt on wedding day. That article had been shared 500,000 times. It had gotten me fired, evicted, and spat on by strangers. Kevin Carter hadn't known he was being used as a weapon, but he had pulled the trigger all the same. Now I would hand him a new target, with better ammunition. "Mr. Carter. My name is Emma Collins. I have a story for you. It's about my twin sister, Ella." I paused, letting the name hang in the air. Specifically, it's about how her clinical depression diagnosis is a complete fabrication, supported by forged medical records from a doctor who's been cited 7 times for fraud. I have the documents. I have the chat logs where she admits it. I have video evidence of her faking symptoms. Are you interested? There was a long pause on the other end, the particular silence of a journalist who smells blood in the water and is already reaching for his harpoon. "I'm listening," he said, and I could hear the hunger in his voice. "Send me everything." Ella moved into the penthouse the very next morning, giddy with triumph. By noon, she was live streaming from my grandmother's velvet sofa, wearing my silk robe, the one with my monogram embroidered on the pocket, the panoramic windows framing the bay behind her like a monument to her victory. Ethan lounged beside her, his arm draped possessively over her shoulders, his fingers occasionally brushing the curve of her neck. "True love conquers all," she cooed into the camera, tilting her head against his shoulder with practiced grace. "Emma has finally accepted it. She even gave us this beautiful home as a gift. I think, deep down, she knows Ethan and I were always meant to be. Some people are just meant to step aside so true love can flourish." She dabbed at her eye with a tissue, a single tear catching the light. "I forgive her, you know. For everything. I hope one day she finds her own happiness." The donations poured in, heart emojis and cash gifts from her adoring fans, people who had been trained by years of her content to see her as a fragile angel persecuted by a cruel world. The comments glowed with adoration. "Such a pure soul. She deserves the world after everything she's been through." Look how gracious she is, forgiving her horrible sister. A true queen. I watched the stream from a cramped studio apartment I had rented under a fake name, 40 minutes outside the city. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and damp plaster. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster. It was a far cry from the penthouse. The entire apartment could have fit into its walk-in closet, but it had one crucial advantage. No one knew I was here. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter heat, as my other phone buzzed. Tiffany, buyer found. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski. Cash offer, $7.8 million. They want to do a walkthrough this morning. I told them the current occupants are tenants behind on rent. They're not happy. They're on their way now. I smiled and switched to the second screen, where 8 hidden camera feeds displayed every corner of the penthouse. I had installed them the night before Ella moved in, slipping into the apartment while she was still at the hotel, moving through the rooms with the silence of a ghost. Ella was mid-laugh on the sofa, her head thrown back, Ethan's hand on her thigh, when the doorbell rang. She ignored it. It rang again, longer this time. And then someone started pounding, heavy, insistent, the kind of pounding that rattles the door in its frame and sends vibrations through the floor. Ella's laugh cut off. She exchanged a confused, irritated glance with Ethan before padding to the door in her bare feet, my robe trailing behind her. Probably just a delivery, she muttered to her audience, forcing a smile. I'll be right back, lovelies. She opened the door. Tiffany stood there, pale and flustered, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. And behind her, looming like storm clouds, was a couple who looked like they had stepped out of a reality show about sudden, aggressive wealth. Mrs. Kowalski was a stout woman with aggressively red lipstick that had bled slightly into the fine lines around her mouth, and a tiny, trembling chihuahua tucked under her arm. The dog wore a rhinestone collar that spelled out, Princess. Mr. Kowalski was built like a refrigerator, his neck tattoo, a coiled dragon breathing fire, peeking above his collar, gold chains glinting against a chest thick with muscle. 2 hulking men in dark suits stood behind them, their expressions blank and unfriendly, their hands clasped in front of them like bouncers at an exclusive club. Mrs. Kowalski looked Ella up and down with undisguised disdain, her gaze snagging on the monogrammed robe. "This is the tenant," she said, her voice carrying the nasal twang of old money that had come in fast and hard. "Why isn't she packed? We closed this morning. The place should be empty. I was told vacant possession." Ella's smile froze, then flickered, like a light bulb about to burn out. "I'm sorry, there's been a mistake. I'm not a tenant. I'm the owner. This is my home. My sister gave it to me." Mr. Kowalski barked a laugh that rattled the doorframe. His gold chains jangled against his chest. "Owner. Lady, I just wired $7.8 million for this property not 2 hours ago. The deed's in my hand. Signed, sealed, recorded." He pulled a folded document from his jacket and shook it open in front of her face. "You got about 30 seconds to explain before my associates here start relocating your belongings to the curb. And they're not gentle." Ella's face went through a rapid series of expressions, each one more desperate than the last: confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning, sickening comprehension that drained the color from her cheeks. She snatched the document from his hand, her eyes scanning the page with frantic speed. The deed was clear. The owner was Emma Collins. The sale had been finalized at 9 that morning. There was her signature. I had forged it perfectly, of course, after years of watching her practice her own name in that looping, attention-seeking script. "She sold it," Ella whispered. Her voice cracked, and for once it wasn't an act. The mask slipped, and beneath it was naked, animal fury. She gave it to us and then she sold it out from under us. That bitch sold my house. Her hands began to shake, real tremors, not the theatrical ones she deployed on camera, and I watched her composure, the composure she had weaponized for 20 years, splinter like thin ice under a heavy boot. She grabbed her phone, nearly dropping it twice, and dialed my number with trembling fingers. I let it ring 3 times before answering, savoring the pause. Emma. You promised me this house. You said it was a gift. On camera. Everyone heard you. Her scream was so shrill it distorted the phone speaker, and behind her I could hear the Chihuahua yapping hysterically and Mr. Kowalski bellowing, "Time's up, princess." I let the silence hang for a long moment before replying, my voice calm and measured, the voice of someone discussing the weather. I said you could use it as a wedding home, Ella. I never said I was giving you the deed. You've lived there for a whole day. That's more than generous, don't you think? The new owners want possession by tomorrow. I suggest you start packing. I paused. Oh, and Ella. You might want to check the live stream. I think your audience is still watching. I hung up before she could respond. On the camera feed, I watched her look back at the phone on its tripod, still streaming, still recording, and the blood drained from her face entirely. She lunged for the phone, fumbling to turn it off, but it was too late. The comments were already flooding in. Wait, she doesn't own the house. She's been lying this whole time. Get her off the stream. Fraud. She's a fraud. The Kowalski's Chihuahua yapped relentlessly, its tiny bark echoing through the marble foyer like a laugh track from hell. That night, I sat in the dark of my rented apartment and opened the encrypted folder I had been building for 2 lifetimes. Inside were videos, screenshots, medical records, chat logs, the meticulous archive of Ella's deceptions, each file a brick in the fortress of her destruction. The kitchen video from 15 years ago, salvaged from a discarded hard drive that my father had thrown away. The cell phone footage of her tearing my exam ticket, filmed by a hidden camera I had installed in my own bedroom after years of suspicion, a camera no one else knew about. The transcripts of her conversations with a friend, where she bragged about faking her depression diagnosis because it was the perfect get-out-of-jail-free card. I just have to cry a little and everyone gives me whatever I want. My idiot sister gets on her knees and begs. It's almost too easy. And so much more. Bank records. Witness statements from the 7 men she had conned. The name and medical records of the boy she had driven to attempt suicide when they were in college, a boy who now used a wheelchair and had never received justice. I had everything. I had spent 2 years in my previous life compiling this file, driven by a desperate, dying need to understand why my own twin had dedicated her existence to destroying mine. And now I had the answer. There was no reason. She did it because she could. Because she enjoyed it. Because every time I suffered, she felt powerful. The revelation should have broken me all over again. Instead, it freed me. She wasn't a tragic figure. She wasn't sick. She was just cruel. And cruelty could be answered. I emailed the first batch of documents to Kevin Carter at 3 in the morning, when the world felt still and heavy and the only light in the room was the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. His reply came within minutes, a single line that vibrated with barely contained excitement. This is dynamite. I'm running the first piece in 3 days. Can you give me more? I could. I had a lifetime of more. The first article dropped on a Thursday morning, and the internet cracked open. The headline was devastating in its simplicity, a dagger aimed directly at the heart of Ella's carefully constructed persona. Ella Collins does not have depression. Beneath it, 12,000 words of meticulous reporting, complete with scanned medical records from a clinic that had been shut down for fraud 3 years prior, notarized testimony from the disgraced doctor who had signed her bogus diagnosis in exchange for cash, and technical verification of chat logs where Ella had written, in her own words, time-stamped and authenticated, that her depression was the perfect shield, and that her sister was so easy to manipulate it's almost boring. The article went viral within hours. By noon, the hashtag #EllaExposed was trending nationally, a relentless scroll of outrage and vindication. Her live-stream platform suspended her account within the hour. Her sponsorship deals, the luxury skincare brand, the wellness tea company, the meditation app that had paid her 6 figures to be their mental health ambassador, evaporated overnight. Comment sections that had once overflowed with sympathy now churned with a fury so intense it seemed to vibrate off the screen. Ella, in a desperate, flailing attempt at damage control, went live from a backup account. She looked terrible, pale, eyes red-rimmed, her hair lank and unwashed, and she was clearly aiming for a broken victim aesthetic. A glass of water trembled in her hand. "I'm having a panic attack," she gasped, pressing her palm to her chest in the gesture her followers knew well. "All these lies, this smear campaign, my sister has paid off a journalist to destroy me. I can't breathe, please, you have to believe me." She let the glass slip from her fingers and shatter on the floor. A nice touch, I had to admit. But the audience had changed. They had seen the trick too many times. The comments were brutal. "Her hand isn't even shaking. That glass was steady as a rock. Give her an Oscar. Where was her panic attack when her sister was on her knees begging? That's some impressive breath control for someone who supposedly can't breathe. Fake. Fake. Fake." The live stream cut off mid-sob, terminated by the platform for violating its terms of service. Ella's digital empire, built over years of carefully curated victimhood and monetized vulnerability, crumbled in less than a week. The penthouse was gone. The sponsors were gone. The adoring fans were gone. She was left with nothing but the echo of her own lies. Ethan arrived at the penthouse that night, but not to comfort her. He burst through the door with a face like thunder, his phone clutched in his fist so tightly his knuckles were white. The apartment was a wreck. Empty wine bottles lined the counters like a graveyard of bad decisions, clothes were strewn across the floor in tangled heaps, and the sour, stale smell of neglect hung in the air. The panoramic windows, once her backdrop of triumph, now framed only the cold, indifferent lights of the city. Ella sat on the bedroom windowsill, barefaced and hollow-eyed, wearing a rumpled t-shirt that had a coffee stain on the collar. She looked up at him, and for a fleeting moment I almost felt something like pity. Almost. Then I remembered the rooftop, the wind, the countdown, and the pity evaporated like mist. "You lied to me," he spat, hurling his phone onto the bed. The screen lit up with the headline of Kevin's article. 3 years. 3 years you've been playing me. The depression, the suicide attempts, the helpless little girl act, all of it was a con. Every tear, every panic attack, every time you said you couldn't live without me, it was all a performance. Do you have any idea what this has done to my reputation? My father's board is demanding my resignation. The investors are pulling out. My family's name is being dragged through the mud because I was stupid enough to believe you." Ella didn't flinch. She looked at him with a strange, flat calm that was more unsettling than any outburst. "You knew," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual musical lilt. "Maybe not all of it. Maybe you didn't know about the forged diagnosis. But you knew I wasn't as fragile as I pretended. You knew I was manipulating Emma. You knew I was faking the suicide attempt at the wedding, you were literally waiting outside the door, Ethan. We planned it together. You liked it. You liked being the knight in shining armor. You liked that I made you feel powerful, that I needed you so desperately. She slid off the windowsill and walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the carpet, her eyes never leaving his. Don't pretend you're a victim. You cheated on your fiancé with her twin sister. You lied to Emma's face for months. You took her grandmother's penthouse and didn't lose a minute of sleep. You were happy to destroy her, as long as it benefited you. We're the same, Ethan. We've always been the same. That's why you were drawn to me. Because I'm the mirror you've been avoiding your whole life. His hand jerked upward as if to strike her. The motion was instinctive, unthinking, the reflex of a man who had never been truly challenged. I held my breath, watching through the hidden camera, my finger hovering over the record button. But he didn't hit her. He froze, his arm trembling in the air, and I saw the calculation flicker behind his eyes. The apartment might be bugged. There might be cameras. He couldn't afford another scandal. He lowered his hand slowly, his face twisting with the effort of restraining himself. We're done, he said, his voice ragged, scraped raw. I never want to see you again. If you contact me, I'll get a restraining order. If you mention my name in public, I'll sue you for defamation. You're nothing to me. You're less than nothing. He walked out without looking back. The door slammed behind him with a finality that vibrated through the walls. Ella stood in the middle of the wrecked living room, surrounded by the debris of her life, the empty bottles, the discarded clothes, the shattered remnants of her carefully constructed world, and for a long time she didn't move. Then she began to laugh. It started low, a bitter, hollow sound, and then it climbed, becoming something wild and unhinged, laughter that dissolved into sobs and back into laughter again. I couldn't tell if those tears were real or just another performance, and in the end, it didn't matter. She had spent her whole life blurring the line between the two until even she no longer knew the difference. She fled to our parents' house that night, arriving at 3 a.m. in a wrinkled coat, dragging a small suitcase with a broken wheel. The house smelled of my mother's lavender sachets and my father's pipe tobacco, the sense of a childhood that had never felt safe. My mother met her at the door in her nightgown and immediately burst into tears, pulling Ella into her arms with the desperate, reflexive love of a woman who had built her entire identity around protecting her fragile youngest child. My baby, my poor baby, what has that horrible sister done to you? She wrapped Ella in a cashmere blanket, made her a cup of chamomile tea with honey, and didn't ask a single question about the news articles or the chat logs or the doctor who had admitted, on the record, to falsifying her diagnosis. She didn't want to know. Knowing would mean confronting the unbearable truth that she had spent 20 years pouring her love into a mirage while her other daughter starved in the dark. The guilt would crush her. So she chose blindness. Again. My father was less gentle. He grabbed his phone and dialed my number, his voice shaking with a fury that had been building for days. Emma. Get back to this house immediately. Do you have any idea what you've done? You sold your grandmother's apartment to strangers. You fed lies to some muckraking reporter. Your sister is in pieces because of you. She's destroyed. Her career is gone, her reputation is in tatters, her fiancé has left her, all because of your vindictive, poisonous campaign. You are a disgrace to this family, a venomous, cold-hearted disgrace. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you. I let his rage wash over me, a distant storm, and when he finally paused for breath, his breathing ragged and heavy, I spoke in the same measured tone I had perfected. Dad, before you say anything else, open the file I just sent you. The third attachment. You'll want to see it before you continue this conversation. What file? I don't want your files. I want you to fix this. I want you to call that reporter and retract everything. I want you to give your sister back her apartment. Just look at it. I heard him fumble with his phone, a muttered curse, and then silence. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filling the phone line like water filling a sinking ship. I heard my mother's muffled voice in the background, high and anxious. Frank. Frank, what is it? You've gone pale. Frank, you're scaring me. And then a sound I had never heard my father make in my entire life, a choked, strangled gasp, as if all the air had been punched out of his lungs. It was the sound of a man watching the foundation of his entire worldview crack in real time. Frank. My mother's voice climbed in pitch, edged with panic. What did she send you? The file was a video. 15-year-old security footage, grainy but unmistakable. Little Ella, 10 years old, in her pink pajamas with the cartoon rabbits, climbing onto the step stool. Lifting the kettle from the stove with both hands, the steam curling around her small fingers. Turning to look directly at the camera, a long, deliberate look, her eyes meeting the lens with an awareness that was chilling in someone so young. And then the smile. That sweet, cherubic smile. The boiling water cascading down her own face. Her scream, a raw, animal shriek of genuine agony. And through the agony, as she writhed on the floor, the smile flickering at the corner of her mouth like a secret she was sharing with the camera. A secret that said, I did this. I chose this. And now I will destroy my sister with it. It's fake, my mother whispered when she saw it. Her voice was thin and desperate, the voice of a woman clutching at a lifeline that was already slipping through her fingers. Emma fabricated it. It's one of those deep fake things, those AI generated. Ella would never. Ella has depression, she was a child, she was ill. Laura. My father's voice cut through her denial, and it was hollow in a way that made my mother go silent. He lifted his eyes from the screen and looked at Ella, who had gone very still on the sofa, the cashmere blanket pulled around her feet like a shed skin. His face had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The lines around his mouth had deepened into crevices. His eyes, usually so certain, so authoritative, were lost. Why? He asked, and the word cracked in the middle, splintering like old wood. Why did you do it? You were 10 years old. How could a 10-year-old do something like that to herself? How could you let us lock your sister in the basement for 3 days for something you did to yourself? How could you let us, how could you let me, punish her for 15 years for a crime you committed? Ella looked at him, and something behind her eyes shifted. The mask slipped. For the first time in her life, in front of her parents, the performance stopped. And beneath it was something cold and ancient and utterly remorseless, a void where empathy should have been. She stood up slowly, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. Why? She repeated, and her voice had a serrated edge, sharp enough to draw blood. Because you loved her more. Every single day of my life, you loved her more. She got better grades, you framed her report cards. She won the awards, you hung her certificates in the hallway. She was the one you bragged about at dinner parties, Emma this, Emma that, isn't Emma so brilliant, isn't Emma so accomplished? Her voice rose, filling the room, each word a lash. And what was I? I was the sick one. The difficult one. The one you had to manage. Do you have any idea what it felt like to be invisible in my own house? To watch her get everything, the praise, the pride, the future, while I got pity. I didn't want pity. I wanted what she had. And since I couldn't have it, I decided she wouldn't have it either. I took everything from her. Her education. Her reputation. Her fiancé. Her home. And I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times. Because every time she suffered, I finally felt like I existed. She was breathing hard now, her chest heaving, and the tears streaming down her face were real, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, hot and bitter and decades old. I tore up her exam ticket because I couldn't stand the thought of her going to that university and having one more thing to be proud of while I had nothing. I took Ethan because he was hers and I wanted him to worship me the way he worshipped her. Everything she ever had, I wanted to take. Everything she ever loved, I wanted to destroy. That's why. She raised her chin defiantly, her jaw set like a warrior facing execution. And I'm not sorry. I regret nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. The slap came from my mother. Laura Collins, who had never raised a hand to either of her children in her entire life, who had spent 2 decades coddling and protecting and enabling, brought her palm across Ella's cheek with a crack that echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air, reverberating. My mother's face was a ruin of tears and shock, her hand still suspended in the air as if it belonged to someone else. "You monster," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper, cracked and broken. "I gave you everything. I defended you against everyone. I turned my back on my own daughter, my own flesh and blood, for you. I let Emma starve in the basement. I let her cry outside that exam hall alone. I told her she was selfish for wanting her own wedding day. I chose you, over and over and over, and you were lying. You were lying the whole time. Every tear, every hug, every 'I love you, Mommy,' it was all a lie." My father didn't say a word. He turned and walked out of the room, his shoulders bowed under a weight that had just become unbearable, the weight of 15 years of misplaced blame, of love poured into a void, of a daughter he had abandoned for a phantom. His footsteps were slow and heavy on the hardwood floor, each one a small defeat. I watched him go through the cameras I had installed weeks earlier, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No grief. Just a quiet, hollow stillness, like the silence after a storm. The storm had been raging for 2 lifetimes. The silence was almost unsettling. Kevin Carter's follow-up articles came in a relentless barrage, each one a fresh hammer blow. Ella's university credentials were exposed as complete forgeries. She had dropped out of high school at 16 and never earned a single credit beyond that. 7 men came forward with notarized statements and bank records proving she had conned them out of a combined total of nearly $200,000, spinning tales of medical emergencies and desperate circumstances that were entirely fabricated. A former classmate, her voice trembling with years of suppressed rage, revealed that Ella had systematically psychologically abused a boyfriend in college, isolating him from his friends, gaslighting him into believing he was worthless, until he attempted suicide. He survived, but spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, and Ella had never once visited him or expressed remorse. The boy's mother gave an interview to Kevin, her face lined with grief, holding a photograph of her son before the attempt. "She destroyed him," the woman said, and she never looked back. And then came the most damning revelation of all. Ella had been running a fraudulent charity for 3 years, soliciting donations for depression awareness and mental health support, complete with a professional website and tearful promotional videos. Not a single cent had gone to any mental health organization. The total amount she had funneled into her personal accounts exceeded $400,000, spent on designer handbags, first-class flights, and 5-star hotel suites. Kevin published the bank record side by side with her donation appeals, and the internet erupted with a fury that was almost biblical in its intensity. The police arrested her on a rainy Tuesday evening. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, the blue glow of the television flickering across my face, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in my hands. She had been hiding in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, paying cash under a false name. When the officers led her out, her hair was lank and unwashed, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. She was wearing a stained hoodie and jeans that hung loose on her frame. The influencer who had once broadcast her glamorous life to hundreds of thousands of adoring fans was unrecognizable. When she saw the news cameras waiting outside the motel, because someone had tipped them off, and I knew exactly who, she screamed. Not with the practiced, trembling vulnerability of her old performances, but with raw, animal desperation, the shriek of a cornered creature with no escape routes left. "I have depression. I'm sick. You can't do this to me. I'm a victim. I need help. Someone help me." The officers guided her into the back of a patrol car with firm, practiced hands, and the door closed with a heavy, final thud that cut off her screaming like a guillotine. The comments on the live feed scrolled past in a torrent of vindication. Finally. "Justice for Emma. Rot in there, you monster. 12 years isn't enough." Ethan's downfall came shortly after, a parallel implosion that I had orchestrated with equal precision. An anonymous whistleblower, someone with intimate, detailed knowledge of the Reed family's financial operations, sent a comprehensive dossier to the financial regulators detailing years of fraud, embezzlement, and falsified audits. I knew those documents intimately. I had helped Ethan organize his files during our engagement, and my memory for numbers was, as my grandmother used to say, almost supernatural. The Reed family empire, 3 generations of accumulated wealth and influence, collapsed within weeks. Harrison Reed was arrested at his waterfront estate in his bathrobe, shouting about his lawyers as the cameras flashed. Ethan, stripped of his fortune and his reputation, his social circle evaporated overnight, showed up outside my apartment one evening with a wilted bouquet of roses, the petals were browning at the edges, and a desperate, rehearsed plea in his eyes. The rain was falling in thin, cold sheets, plastering his hair to his forehead and darkening the shoulders of his once expensive coat. He knelt on the wet pavement, the water seeping through the knees of his trousers. "Emma. I was blind. She manipulated me. She twisted everything. But I see clearly now. You're the only one I've ever truly loved. You're the only real thing in my life. Please, give me another chance. Let me prove it to you. Let me spend the rest of my life making it up to you." I looked down at him, this man who had once stood beside my sister and laughed while I fell, who had worn a custom tuxedo to my wedding while planning to leave me at the altar, who had taken my grandmother's penthouse without a flicker of conscience. Rain dripped from the edge of my umbrella, a thin silver curtain between us. I felt a strange, distant pity, not for him, but for the girl I used to be. The girl who had loved him and believed in him and built her entire future around his whispered promises. She deserved better. She deserved someone who would have knelt in the rain for her, not for what he could gain. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice almost gentle, "do you believe in second chances?" Hope flared in his eyes, bright and desperate and hungry, and I let it burn for a long moment, let him believe that his charm might still work, that the old Emma was still in there somewhere, ready to forgive. Then I continued. "Neither do I." The hope died in his eyes like a candle snuffed out, and I watched the light go with a quiet, profound satisfaction. I stepped back inside and closed the door, and the click of the lock sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Through the door, I heard him call my name once more, his voice cracking, and then nothing but the sound of rain. Ella's trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day, the gallery filled with journalists, victims, and the simply curious who had followed the scandal like a national sport. She was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of sentencing, a silk scarf covering my hair, oversized sunglasses hiding my eyes. I didn't need to be there. But I needed to see it. I needed to watch the gavel fall. When the verdict was read, she didn't look at the judge. She looked at me. Her head turned slowly, as if she had known exactly where I was sitting the entire time, and our gazes locked, twin to twin, mirror to mirror. Her eyes were empty now, the fire of her malice guttered into ash, the manic energy of her final confession drained away. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished, the orange jumpsuit swallowing her frame. I held her gaze without flinching. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at her, and let her see what she had made of me, someone who had died and come back, someone who could no longer be broken, someone who had taken every wound she had inflicted and forged them into armor. My mother attended the sentencing. She sat in the front row, her hair now more white than gray. It had turned shockingly fast over the past year, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles jutted out like bone-white marbles. When the guards led Ella away in handcuffs, she paused beside my mother. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small and cracked, stripped of all its theatrical power. "Will you visit me? Please. I'll be so alone in there." My mother looked at her for a long, agonizing time. Her lips parted, and I saw the decades of love and denial and grief warring on her face, a lifetime of choices playing out in the space of a few heartbeats. Then she said, very quietly, the words barely audible even in the hushed courtroom, "When you destroyed Emma, did you remember that she was my daughter too?" She rose from her seat, her movement stiff and slow, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, a fading rhythm. Ella watched her go, and for the first time, the very first time in either of our lives, I saw tears that were not for an audience. They slid down her cheeks, silent and unnoticed, tracking through the faint remnants of makeup. No one was filming. No one was applauding. She was just a woman in an orange jumpsuit, crying for a mother who had finally learned to stop loving her. The heavy door to the holding cells closed behind her with the finality of a grave. 1 year later, in the crisp golden light of autumn, I stood at the window of my new office and watched the ginkgo leaves spiral down from the trees that lined the street below. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the scent of change. I had founded a non-profit organization, the Dawn Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and psychological support to women who had suffered family injustice, online harassment, and emotional abuse. Kevin Carter had surprised everyone by leaving investigative journalism to join as our media director, and together we had already helped dozens of women tell their stories and reclaim their lives. On my desk sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. 2 10-year-old girls in matching sundresses, their hair in identical ponytails, their faces bright with innocent, gap-toothed smiles. It was taken a month before the boiling water, before the lies, before the long fall from the rooftop. In another world, we might have grown old together, shared secrets, leaned on each other when life grew heavy. But that world didn't exist. It had never existed. It was a fantasy, and I had finally stopped mourning it. I picked up the photograph and studied it for a long moment, tracing the outline of our young faces with my fingertip. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and placed it inside, face down. The drawer locked with a soft click. I dropped the key into the ceramic mug on my desk, where it landed among paper clips and loose change, just another small, discarded thing. Some people are meant to stay in the past. Some wounds never fully heal, and some betrayals can never be forgiven. My sister had spent 2 decades trying to erase me, and in the end, she had only erased herself. I had died once, and I had been given the impossible gift of returning. I wasn't going to waste it on hatred. I was going to live, fully, fiercely, and in a way she could never take from me. That was my revenge. That was my peace. My phone buzzed on the desk. Kevin, * new case. Woman whose brother stole her inheritance and had her committed to a psychiatric ward. She's out now. She wants to fight back. Interested? *. I set the photograph aside, closed the drawer, and typed my reply, "Tell her I'm in."